Hey, you ever think about how you'll go? I know, dark question, but stay with me, because tonight I want you to follow me somewhere few dare to look, into the shadows of history, into the exits, the last moments, not just of anyone, but of kings, warriors, thinkers, madmen. The kind of deaths that feel more like poetry written in blood than the dull sigh of fate. The kind that stay with you. But before we get into it, before we turn the key and descend together, do one thing for me. If this kind of deep, strange storytelling is your thing, if you feel that chill of curiosity sneaking down your spine, go ahead, like the video, subscribe. Not for the numbers, just so I know you're walking these halls with me, and drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it haunting, beautiful even, to know who else is awake when the rest of the world sleeps. All right, let's begin, with a king who couldn't die, not like a god. No, like a man who tried. There's a chill I always get when thinking about death, not the kind that comes with age, illness, or accident. I'm talking about the curated kind, the planned ending, a person staring fate in the eyes and saying, not like that, on my terms. It fascinates me, the psychology, the poetry of it, that tightrope walk between control and surrender. And if you've ever wanted to hear the story of a man who tried to master death, not by avoiding it, but by taming it, then let me tell you about Mithridates VI, King of Pontus. A man born not just into royalty, but into paranoia, into legacy, into war. They called him the Poison King. Not because he killed others with it, though he likely did, but because he fed it to himself. Slowly, daily, intimately. Now I first read about Mithridates on a rainy night, the kind of night where you can hear every creak in the walls. I was flipping through an old military history book I picked up for $2 at a second-hand shop. The pages were water-stained, the ink slightly smudged, and there he was, Mithridates VI, a scowling marble bust, staring out like he knew something I didn't. And what struck me wasn't just his title or his wars against Rome. It was the strategy, the mindset, the method. Oh, he wasn't just trying to live longer. He was preparing to die on his schedule. In a world where betrayal was as common as bread, Mithridates decided the real threat wasn't the sword. It was the goblet. So he turned his palace into a laboratory, his body an experiment. A pinch of hemlock, a dash of arsenic, just a lick of belladonna. Every morning, like clockwork, as if daring the universe to find a new way to end him. Over time, this ritual became his obsession, and like most obsessions, it took on a strange beauty. Imagine the discipline required, the trust in your apothecaries, the endless experimentation. He didn't just build immunity, he built a legend. That's where the Mithridateum comes in. An antidote so potent, so mysterious that medieval doctors would later spend centuries trying to replicate it. The recipe was lost, if it ever existed in a single form, but the myth endured, a single elixir born of fear and brilliance that could neutralize almost any toxin. Mithridates didn't eat food. He challenged it. There's something romantic about that, the idea of a man so determined to stay in control of his own death that he poisoned himself daily to ensure no one else could, and for a time, it worked. But you already know what I'm about to say, don't you? Because fate has a strange sense of humor. It watches quietly while we prepare our exits. It waits, amused, while we build our fail-safes. And then, when it's ready, it flips the script. The Roman Empire had been eyeing Pontus for a while. Mithridates wasn't just a regional threat. He was a thorn in the side of Roman ambition. The wars between them were long, brutal, and devastating. Alliances were made and broken. Armies slaughtered. Cities reduced to dust. And eventually Mithridates ran out of luck. His allies turned on him, his borders collapsed, Rome closed in. There's something almost cinematic about the final days of a king. Picture it, the enemy at the gates, the sound of boots on gravel, iron clashing in the distance. Mithridates knew what capture meant. Public humiliation, chains, a forced march through Rome, mocked and spat on. His name, once feared, reduced to a punchline. He wouldn't allow it. He retreated into silence, took the poison, his old friend, and waited for the familiar burn, the dark blur, the descent into sleep. But nothing came. That's the part that gets me every time. After years of slowly building immunity, of turning death into a game, the one time he needed poison to work, it didn't. He couldn't die. He had become immune to his own escape route. His body, so carefully trained, now refused to let go, like a machine too well oiled to break. The very strength he'd built became his prison. I imagine that moment in eerie stillness, Mithridates, alone in some quiet room, realizing he couldn't even die correctly. That the fate he'd feared, capture, humiliation, the Roman spectacle, was now unavoidable. Unless... He turned to one of his guards, a mercenary, and said what I can only assume was some version of "do it, quickly." And with one sword thrust, it was over. Not a graceful fall, not a poet's death, just the cold, hard edge of steel. You ever hear the phrase "death by your own design"? This is what they mean. Mithridates didn't fail. He succeeded too well. He built himself into a fortress, impenetrable, proud, and found in the end that the walls he'd built to keep death out were also too thick to let it in. There's something deeply human in that, isn't there? We plan, we prepare, we try to control the uncontrollable. But death doesn't always read the manual. And maybe that's the lesson of Mithridates, that no matter how clever you are, how thoroughly you build your myth, death has a backup plan. A plan B. Just in case. You ever hear a story that's so bizarre, so precise in its poetic irony, that it feels like someone scripted it? Not history, but a fable from the gods? Let me tell you about one like that. A tale soaked in blood, pride, and the bite of fate, quite literally. This one comes from the Orkney Islands, far up in the wind-swept north, where the sea never sleeps and the rocks remember everything. It's the story of Sigurd Eysteinsson, better known as Sigurd the Mighty, a Viking earl, a warlord, a man carved from salt and bone, and a warrior so determined to win that he ended up losing to a corpse. Now, when I say Viking, I don't mean the horned helmet cartoon stuff. I mean the real thing, iron-willed raiders, men raised in the roar of the ocean, who saw death not as an end, but a promotion. These were people who measured worth not in coin, but in conquest. And Sigurd? He was no exception. He ruled the Orkney Islands sometime in the 9th century, a place where winter bites deeper than any blade, and honor was the only currency that mattered. He was feared, respected, possibly even worshipped by the people around him. His name carried weight. His enemies cursed it. His allies whispered it like a prayer. But of course, a man like that is never without rivals. His name was Mile Breet, the Buck-Toothed. Yeah, that was the guy's nickname, not exactly intimidating at first glance. You hear that and imagine a cartoonish figure with some unfortunate dental work. But don't let the name fool you. He was a Scottish noble, proud, vicious, and he hated Sigurd with the kind of hate that makes men forget sleep. Natsasinte. The two had clashed before, territory disputes, tribal tensions, old wounds that had never really healed. Eventually, the boiling pot overflowed. They agreed to settle it with a battle. Old school. Each man would bring 40 warriors, no tricks, just blood and blades. What? Except Sigurd wasn't feeling particularly honorable that day. Well, instead of 40, he brought 80. You can picture it, can't you? The Scottish warriors lined up on the field, waiting, watching as the horizon darkens, with double the expected force. And Briggt, with his defiant, buck-toothed scowl, realizing far too late that this wasn't going to be a fair fight. What followed was a slaughter, one-sided, merciless, loud, the kind of battle that isn't really a battle at all, just a chore for the gods of war. Sigurd's men tore through them, no prisoners, no hesitations, and in the chaos, he personally beheaded Briggt. That should have been the end of it. Victory. But Sigurd wasn't content with simply winning. No, he wanted a trophy, a reminder, maybe something to show the rest of the islands, something that said, "Don't mess with me or you'll end up like him." So he did what any self-respecting Viking warlord might do in a moment of adrenaline-fueled pride. He strapped Brigt's severed head to his saddle. Not on a pike, not in a box, just tied it up like luggage and galloped off into the fog, probably laughing, the smell of blood still thick in the air. But here's the thing. Even in death, Breit wasn't done with him. As Sigurd rode back across the countryside, mud flying, wind screaming, heart still pounding with the high of battle, that head bumped along beside him, over and over again, with every gallop, every jolt, until one of Breit's infamous buck teeth scraped against Sigurd's leg. Just a scratch. Barely noticeable at first. But this wasn't the 21st century. This was the 800s. No antiseptic, no antibiotics, no emergency rooms. A scratch in the wrong place at the wrong time was a death sentence wrapped in a whisper. The wound festered. The infection spread. And within days, Sigurd the Mighty, conqueror of the Orkneys, slayer of enemies, wielder of blood and fire, was dead. Not by sword, not in battle, but by a tooth. A dead man's tooth. There's something almost surgical in the precision of that irony, isn't there? He cheated his way to victory and got killed by the very man he defeated. Not even the man's hand, just the ghost of his mouth. When I first heard this story, I laughed. Out loud. It sounded like a dark joke, something a drunken bard might tell to liven up a winter fire. But the more I sat with it, the more it gnawed at me. Because there's a lesson buried in there, sharper than any fang. You can win the war, crush your enemies, rule your kingdom with an iron fist, but arrogance? Arrogance has teeth, and sometimes they bite you long after the mouth has stopped moving. Sigurd thought the fight was over. He thought he'd written the final chapter. Instead, he became the punchline of his own saga. Can you imagine being the man who died from winning too hard? They say the gods of old were petty, that they delighted in irony. I like to think that somewhere, as Sigurd's body rotted into the earth, Breit was grinning with those oversized teeth, smiling into the void, knowing he got the last bite. And it makes me wonder how many of us carry around our victories, proud and bold, never realizing something we've strapped to our saddle might be sharp enough to undo everything. The things we flaunt, the things we celebrate. They swing beside us, sometimes too close, and sometimes they cut. So, next time you think you've won, really won, check your saddle, and maybe, just maybe, leave the heads where they fell. And so, you ever have one of those nights where everything feels just off? I do. Sometimes I lie in bed, lights off, phone face down, and I think about how thin the line is between power and absurdity, how we can climb so high with legions behind us, armor gleaming, and still, it takes only one mistake, one blind corner, to erase it all. That's how I think of Pyrrhus. He wasn't just any Greek general. He was the Greek general, born around 319 BCE, raised in the echo of Alexander the Great's conquests. He grew up with maps etched in blood and ambition tattooed across his bones. The world was still reeling from the ripple of Alexander's empire, and Pyrrhus wanted to carve his name into that legacy. And for a while, he did. This man fought with a kind of violent poetry. His enemies feared him. Even Rome, at the height of its growing power, called him one of their most dangerous foes. He's the reason we use the phrase Pyrrhic victory. It means winning at such a cost that it might as well be a loss. Pyrrhus was a master of that, beating back the enemy, yes, but bleeding himself dry in the process. It was almost like he loved the act of war more than the result, the drama of it, the performance. I once read this passage in an old military chronicle. The writer said Pyrrhus treated battles like theater. Every movement was staged, every charge choreographed, and his enemies, Rome included, always left the fight wondering how one man could cause so much chaos with so little to show for it in the end, in an inset. Right? And then, of course, came Argos. By this point, Pyrrhus was weary, not just in body, but in spirit. He had been fighting for years, across Greece, Italy, Macedonia. His victories had piled up, but so had the corpses. His own men were tired. His enemies were everywhere. Still, one more battle. That's the part that always catches my breath. One more. As if fate was just waiting for him to ask. It was 272 BCE. He entered the city of Argos at night. Undercover, practically. The streets were narrow, winding, not made for the weight of an army, especially not an army with war elephants. You heard me right. Elephants. Pyrrhus had brought them with him, symbols of terror and exotic might. But they didn't do well in cities, especially cities not designed for creatures that large and stubborn. The elephants got stuck. Soldiers lost their way in the dark. Confusion reigned. Instead of organized conquest, it was chaos. Men shouting, horns blowing, armor clanging through alleyways lit only by torchlight. And Pyrrhus, the general, the king, the legend, ended up sword fighting in a side street, like a drunk mercenary, not the architect of armies. And somewhere above, on a rooftop, she watched. We don't know her name. That's always bothered me. An old woman, maybe a grandmother. Maybe she had sons fighting in the streets. Maybe she just hated war. Maybe she was just tired. But what we do know is this. She had a roof tile, a chunk of baked clay, and she had opinions. Maybe she'd thrown things before, at chickens, grandchildren, stray cats. Maybe this wasn't her first time leaning over the edge, frustrated at the noise, the flames, the endless stupidity of men with swords. Whatever the reason, she didn't hesitate. She dropped it. And fate, with its terrible aim and perfect timing, guided that tile like an arrow. It struck Pyrrhus square in the head, not a glancing blow, a crack. He crumpled. Not in slow motion, not with a final monologue, just down. And that was it. A soldier, confused and probably desperate, saw him fall and rushed over. Didn't even recognize him at first. Just saw an enemy. Stabbed him. Done. I am Pyrrhus of Epirus, cousin of Alexander, conqueror, warrior, lion-hearted general. Killed by a roof tile. Finished off in a puddle by a street fighter. No glory, no statue, no last charge. Just an old woman with good aim and terrible timing. You know, when I first told this story to a friend, he laughed, and then he got quiet, because that's what this story does to you. It's funny, yes, but not in a way that makes you feel safe. It's the kind of funny that lives next door to dread. It makes you realize that no matter how high you climb, the ground is always waiting. And sometimes the final blow doesn't come from a god. It comes from above. From a grandmother. With a tile. There's no holiday for her, no marble bust, but maybe there should be. Not because she meant to kill a king, but because, in a single moment of impulse, she reminded the world how fragile greatness really is. And Pyrrhus? He became the story itself, a lesson whispered across centuries. That ambition is a fire that doesn't care who it burns. That battles are won in the streets as often as they are on maps. And that no amount of armor can stop gravity when it finally decides it's your turn. There are deaths in history that whisper, soft exits, quiet heartbeats fading behind curtains. And then there are the ones that won't shut up. The ones that go kicking, screaming, thrashing, and dragging everyone down with them. And when it comes to endings that refuse to stay dead, no one does it quite like Grigory Rasputin. Now, I've always been fascinated by people who don't fit, misfits, mystics, monsters maybe, the ones who walk into the story sideways, like they were never supposed to be there. But now you can't look away. Rasputin wasn't a man. He was a rupture, a walking contradiction, a messiah wrapped in dirt and beard oil. The first time I saw a photo of him, I genuinely flinched. Those eyes, they don't look at you. They look through you, like he knows what you're hiding, even if you don't. But let's rewind. Grigory Rasputin wasn't born into royalty or wealth. He came from Siberia, cold, ragged places. He was the kind of child that locals whispered about. He talked to animals, disappeared for days, had visions, claimed he could see sin like it was smoke rising off a man's skin. And people believed him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was charisma. Maybe some part of it was real. But whatever it was, he rose. From wandering mystic to spiritual advisor to the Tsarina of Russia herself, Alexandra Fyodorovna, wife of Nicholas II, the last Tsar. She brought Rasputin into the royal court like a secret flame. He was supposed to help her son, the young heir who suffered from hemophilia, a disease that made even the smallest injury life-threatening. And Rasputin helped. Or seemed to. No one's quite sure how. Maybe it was suggestion. Maybe it was pure luck. But whenever the boy's bleeding got bad, Rasputin would be called. He'd speak in that gravel and moonlight voice, pray over the child, touch his skin, and the bleeding would stop. To Alexandra, this man wasn't just a healer. He was a divine gift, an angel of Siberian dirt and divinely tangled hair. And to everyone else, he was a problem, a huge one. Rasputin didn't just linger in the palace like a priest. He spread, like mold. He was in every room, whispering in ears, interfering with appointments, telling the Tsarina who to trust, which generals to fire, which ministers to promote. And this peasant, this greasy-eyed oracle with his stained robes and wine breath, was shaping policy in the world's largest empire. The nobility hated him. The clergy feared him. The people, they whispered stories. That he bathed in sin. That he couldn't be killed. That he'd bedded half the royal court. Maybe all of it was true. Maybe none of it. That's the thing with people like Rasputin. Their reality is so warped that even the truth can't find footing. But the court had had enough. So they plotted, quietly, carefully, like men planning to kill a god. The lead conspirator was Prince Felix Yusupov, a wealthy, noble, eccentric married into the royal family. He and a few others planned the murder like a dinner party from hell. The plan was simple. Well, no, not simple. Thorough. They invited Rasputin to Yusupov's palace on a cold December night in 1916. Wine was poured, cakes were served. And Rasputin, always hungry for pleasure and praise, accepted. He didn't know the wine was poisoned. And he didn't know the cakes were laced with cyanide. Cyanide, one of the deadliest substances on earth. Enough, they said, to kill 5 men. Rasputin ate. He drank. He smiled. No reaction. None. They waited. They watched. Minutes passed. An hour, 2. Rasputin just kept talking, laughing, lecturing on the spirit and temptation. One of the men excused himself, went upstairs, and came back down with a gun. They didn't want to, not yet. But something was wrong. Rasputin should have been dead. And when something's supposed to be dead and isn't, people get scared. So they shot him. Point blank. He fell. Collapsed onto the rug, breathless, still. Relief filled the room. They poured drinks, celebrated, patted each other on the back. But someone, out of caution or curiosity, went to check. They leaned in close. Rasputin opened his eyes. Not wide, not surprised, just angry. And then he sat up. Like a corpse, remembering it had business to finish. He didn't say anything. He just moved, with blood pouring down his chest, toward the stairs. They panicked. They shot him again, twice, 3 times, in the back, in the side, in the head. Finally, he dropped again. But by this point, logic was useless. Fear had taken over. One of them, wild-eyed, grabbed a blunt object, a club or iron rod, and beat Rasputin until his skull split open. You'd think that was the end, right? No, not yet. Because paranoia, once it blooms, is impossible to unroot. So they bound him in cloth, wrapped him like a cursed mummy, and dragged his body through the snow to the Neva River. It was frozen that night. They cracked the ice, dropped him into the blackness. Let the water bury what bullets and poison could not. And then they waited. Days later, his body was found downstream. Face pale, lips blue. But his arms, they were up, frozen in place. Fingers curled, scratching at the underside of the ice. As if he had woken up again, underwater, and tried to crawl out. Tried to live. One more time. Rasputin didn't die like a man. He died like a prophecy. Like a creature the universe wasn't quite ready to release. His death sent ripples through the empire. But it was too late. The Tsarina was shattered. The Tsar weakened. The monarchy, already cracking, began to crumble. Within months, the Romanovs would fall. Within a year, they'd all be dead. Shot in a basement. No last rites. No empire. Some say Rasputin cursed them, that his murder doomed Russia to civil war, to revolution, to a century of blood. But I don't think it was a curse. I think Rasputin was just a mirror. He didn't bring chaos, he revealed it, showed the cracks, and then fell through them. I think about him sometimes. Not the man, the idea of him. The man who wouldn't die. The man who lived too long in rooms he didn't belong in. Who slithered between belief and manipulation until even his enemies weren't sure what was real. He was a priest and a predator, a healer and a parasite, a mystic and a politician, a man and something else. And in the end, they didn't just kill him, they tried to erase him. With poison, with bullets, with a club, with freezing water. And yet, here we are, still saying his name. Still wondering. Still not entirely sure if he ever really left. All right, let your mind settle for a moment, because the next death, well, it doesn't roar like Rasputin's. It doesn't claw at the ice or dodge bullets. This one laughs. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean belly laughter. Gasping for air laughter. That kind of laughter that folds your ribs in half, makes you cry, makes your body shake so hard your brain forgets how to breathe. Imagine that, dying of joy. Or absurdity. Or both. Let me tell you about Chrysippus of Soli, a philosopher of such serious intellect. He laughed himself right into the afterlife. Don't you ever meet someone who takes everything way too seriously? The kind of person who reads the fine print on a cereal box and then gives you a lecture about the philosophical implications of sugar? That was Chrysippus. Thod, one of the great Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece. Born sometime around 280 BCE in Soli, near modern-day Turkey, Chrysippus didn't just study logic, he lived it. He believed in reason above all, emotional restraint, the virtue of self-control. He could talk for hours about ethics, about the natural order, about accepting your fate with dignity. He was the kind of guy who probably frowned at jokes and took pride in his frown. And yet, that's not how he's remembered. No. So, the man who could out-argue a statue, who wrote over 700 works on philosophy, none of which survive intact, by the way, is remembered for one thing. He laughed at a donkey, and then he died. I still remember reading that story for the first time, thinking, there's no way this is real. But the sources agree, even if the details vary slightly. It happened one afternoon. Picture it, Chrysippus, in his flowing robes, pacing around his garden, probably rehearsing some brilliant thought about fate or the universe's indifference. And then he sees it. A donkey. Eating figs. That's it. No divine message, no grand omen. Just a donkey. Munching away. And something about that moment, maybe the absurdity, maybe the timing, maybe something he'd been bottling up for years, snapped. He turned to a servant and said, "Give that donkey some wine to wash down the figs." A joke. A rare joke from a man who rarely bothered. But then he started laughing. Not a chuckle. Not a philosopher's polite HM. I'm talking tears in his eyes, gasping for breath, hands on knees laughter. The kind that seizes your whole body, takes over your lungs, rattles your chest like a storm in a cave. And he didn't stop. Minutes passed, then more, and then he died. Now sure, ancient sources aren't always trustworthy. Some claim he suffered a stroke, others suggest he choked, but the most repeated version, the version that survived centuries, he literally laughed himself to death. And for a Stoic, that's, well, the ultimate contradiction. Stoicism is all about self-mastery, emotional control, facing death without fear or fuss. But Chrysippus didn't go out with solemnity. He went out laughing at a donkey joke. You know, I think about that more often than I'd like to admit. Because on the surface, it's ridiculous. But just beneath, it's kind of perfect. What better way for a man who spent his whole life dissecting the cosmos than to be undone by one random, earthy, absurd little moment? It's as if the universe, tired of his lectures, said, "Okay, Professor, try explaining this." Boom. Not for a donkey. Figs. Wine. End scene. Sometimes when I'm out walking, especially late, when the world is quiet and the streetlights buzz like old neon, I wonder if that's how I'll go. Not in pain, not in fear, but laughing at something stupid, something small. Because isn't that life? It's never the grand things that break us. It's the splinter, the flat tire, the fig-eating donkey at the wrong moment. But here's the real kicker. Despite how silly his death sounds, Chrysippus left a legacy that still matters. His writings influenced generations of thinkers, the Stoics, the Cynics, even the early Christians borrowed his ideas. He helped shape how we understand fate, logic, ethics. And yet, ask someone on the street who he was. The guy who laughed himself to death. That's what survives. Not the volumes of thought. Not the complex ethical theories. The joke. The fall. The laughter. There's a strange kind of immortality in that. Because maybe that's what we remember best about people. Not what they thought, but how they lived. And when we're lucky, how they left. And Chrysippus? He left with a laugh. Right. Take a deep breath, because this next one hurts in a different way. It's not about arrogance in battle or poison immunity or laughing too hard. It's about something more delicate, something strangely innocent, almost childlike. It's about believing in something so deeply, so fully, that you're willing to fall for it. Literally. Let me tell you about Franz Reichelt, a tailor, an inventor, and the man who jumped off the Eiffel Tower wearing a homemade parachute suit. Every once in a while, I think about the things people build with their hands. Not just inventions, but dreams, ideas woven together with fabric and wire and willpower, because buried inside those creations is something raw, something human. What? Reichelt's story. It hits different, because I don't think he was crazy. I think he was hopeful. And hope, when it's cracked just slightly off center, becomes a kind of madness. And see, he was an Austrian-born tailor living in Paris in the early 20th century. Just a man with thread and ambition. But Reichelt didn't just make coats. He wanted to make history. He had a vision, one that was far ahead of his time. What if he wondered falling didn't have to mean dying? Remember, this was the early 1900s. Planes were still flimsy, dangerous contraptions. Flying was new, crashing was common. And parachutes? Bulky, awkward, often useless. Reichelt believed he could solve it. His dream? A wearable parachute. A coat that could become wings. Not in metaphor, in function. He spent years working on it, sketching, stitching, testing prototypes. Not on people, at first, but on mannequins. Dummy after dummy, dropped from the windows of his workshop, from balconies, from ladders. Free. Most of them fell like stones. Oh, geez. But Reichelt was undeterred. He believed. That's the part that breaks me. He didn't just hope it would work. He believed it would. Enough to bet his life. In early 1912, he announced that he would test the suit himself. From the Eiffel Tower. He petitioned the police for permission, promised it would be safe, promised it would be a test with a dummy. The authorities gave a weary nod. They didn't really take him seriously. But Franz Reichelt wasn't bluffing. On February 4th, 1912, he arrived at the Eiffel Tower just after dawn. His invention folded around him, a bulky, winged suit made of silk and canvas, part coat, part cocoon. Crowds had gathered. Journalists were there. Cameras, primitive but rolling, were pointed up. Even the police had shown up again, not to stop him, but to watch. It was foggy that morning. The kind of Paris fog that makes everything feel haunted. Reichelt stood on the first platform, about 187 feet above the ground. Not exactly space travel, but far enough for the fall to kill him. He walked to the edge, paused, and waved. That detail gets me every time. He waved, not like a man about to jump to his death, but like someone boarding a train. There was confidence in that motion, pride, maybe even joy. Then he stepped forward and dropped. I don't have to tell you what happened next. The suit didn't work. It didn't even slow him. He fell like a stone wrapped in hope, and when he hit the frozen ground below, the sound echoed. People screamed. Reporters turned away. The silence that followed was heavy, too heavy for a man whose dream had been made of fabric and sky. Reichelt was killed instantly. His body, twisted, broken, was measured and photographed by the same authorities who'd signed off on his demonstration. The newspapers the next day didn't hold back. The flying tailor dies in fall from Eiffel Tower. Inventor's parachute fails to open. Death leaped before hundreds. Some laughed, some pitied, some just moved on. But the image of him, frozen in the grainy black and white footage, arms wide as he leapt into nothing, that image never left. Here's the part I can't stop thinking about. Reichelt didn't jump to die. He jumped to prove something. To himself, to the world, to the sky. And I wonder, in those final seconds, when the wind roared in his ears, when the ground rushed up like a verdict, did he realize it? That belief isn't always enough. That sometimes dreaming with your eyes closed gets you crushed? Or maybe he felt peace. Maybe he thought, I did it. And the betrayal came in the last blink. I don't know. None of us do. But what we do know is this. He died believing. And that, more than anything, makes it tragic. Because failure is one thing. But failing in front of the sky? That's something else. They buried Reichelt in a quiet grave. His invention, it never caught on. The design was flawed, the materials too heavy, the physics misunderstood. But in a strange, cruel twist, his death did push people to take personal safety in aviation more seriously. His failure made way for improvements. Better parachutes, real testing. He saw other people live because he didn't. History has a strange way of honoring its martyrs, not with parades, but with progress. So, when people ask me if I've heard the story of the man who jumped from the Eiffel Tower in a flying coat, I don't laugh. I just nod. And I remember that wave. That stupid, brave, beautiful wave. And I wonder how many of us walk through life with wings made of thread, just praying the air will hold us. Let's descend now into something darker, not strange in a laughing way, not tragic in a dreamer's fall, but something humiliating. Something so twisted it feels more like a warning than a story. A tale of power lost, of a man who ruled Rome, marched east with a crown on his head, and ended up on his knees. Literally. This is the story of Valerian, the Roman emperor who was captured in battle and then turned into furniture. Yeah, you heard me right. Let's begin. We don't talk much about the 3rd century CE. It's the forgotten middle child of Roman history. No golden age, no Augustus or Julius. Just chaos, rot, plague, civil war. The empire was cracking. You could hear it in the tremble of the legions, in the whispers of the Senate. Every year brought a new rebellion, a new pretender, a new wound that wouldn't heal. And in the middle of all that stood Valerian. An emperor trying to keep the whole thing from falling apart. Now Valerian wasn't a monster. Not like Caligula, not an icon like Caesar. He was a soldier emperor, one of many during that period, chosen more for his command than charisma. A stopgap, a placeholder. But he tried. I think that's what makes this worse. He actually tried to hold the empire together. He fought against Germanic invasions in the west, managed crumbling borders, and when Persia, yes, Persia, started pushing into the Roman East under a terrifyingly capable king named Shapur I, Valerian did what emperors were supposed to do. He marched, gathered his armies, rode into the east, to remind the world that Rome was still Rome. Only it wasn't. The Battle of Edessa. It's not famous, not like Cannae or Actium, but it should be, because it's where Rome was reminded, violently, that even the mightiest empire bleeds. Valerian's army was decimated, wiped out, disease, poor supply lines, tactical errors, it all collapsed, and Valerian, emperor of Rome, the man whose face was carved into coins, was taken alive. That alone was a seismic event. Or not. Roman emperors didn't get captured. They died in battle. They fell on their swords. They never, ever let themselves become trophies. But Valerian? He was dragged in chains to the Persian court. And Shapur? Oh, Shapur was thrilled. This wasn't just a victory, it was an opportunity. And this is where things get grotesque. Because instead of ransoming Valerian back to Rome or negotiating terms, Shapur decided to keep him. Not as a guest, as a footstool. Yes, you heard that right. According to several ancient sources, most notably Lactantius, a Christian historian with a flair for drama, Shapur had Valerian kneel before him whenever he wanted to mount his horse. Imagine that. The Emperor of Rome, on his hands and knees. Salts. While a Persian king planted a sandal between his shoulder blades and climbed aboard like Valerian was a block of marble. Every single day. That wasn't power. That was punishment with choreography. It wasn't just about domination. It was about theater. Making sure the world saw Rome brought low, making sure the humiliation wasn't hidden behind closed doors, but performed like a ritual. And Valerian, he endured it. How long? We don't know for certain. Months? Years? It depends on which historian you ask. But it doesn't end there, because Shapur, like most conquerors, believed in final acts. And Valerian's? Well, it's one of the most brutal exits in the history of empires. Some say Shapur eventually grew bored of his human stool, so he had Valerian flayed, skinned, his body emptied, stuffed with straw, and then mounted, displayed in a temple, like a hunting trophy. A former emperor reduced to a warning in leather, a cautionary tale made literal. Others say this might have been exaggerated, a bit of propaganda, a Christian flourish. But the fact that it's possible, that it's plausible, is enough. And Rome, they never got him back. Never negotiated, never sent a rescue. They pretended it didn't happen. Officially, Valerian just disappeared. The propaganda machine rolled on. Rome couldn't afford to acknowledge that their emperor had been turned into upholstery. But history remembered. And still does. And I think about Valerian sometimes. Not because I admire him, not because he changed the world, but because his death is such a violent reversal. A man who sat on a throne, now knelt beneath one. Not metaphorically, not politically, physically. There's something uniquely cruel in that, and hauntingly symbolic, because it tells us what power really is, and what it's not. You can have legions behind you. You can wear purple robes. You can put your name on every column, every coin, every map. But the moment someone stronger wants to make a point, you're on your knees. You're not a god. You're a platform. And if you're lucky, you're forgotten. If not, you're remembered like this. So when people ask me what the worst way to die is, I don't say poison, or fire, or the blade. I say being remembered like furniture, because that's what happened to Valerian. An emperor who tried, but lost, and became a rug in someone else's empire. The last time we talked, we saw a Roman emperor get turned into something you'd rest your boots on. And just when you think it can't get stranger, we cross into territory that feels almost comedic, until you realize someone actually died this way. Homer. It's a story I can't tell without pausing now and then, not to laugh, but to appreciate just how perfectly bizarre history can be. Because this is the story of a king who died from eating dessert. Oh, literally. His name was Adolf Frederick of Sweden. And the meal that killed him wasn't laced with poison or soaked in wine. It was just too much. Way too much. Let me paint the scene. Sweden, the 18th century. A time when monarchs still wore powdered wigs and ruled by divine right, but were also increasingly being boxed in by parliaments, rising literacy, and an impatient public. Adolf Frederick wasn't exactly a warlord. He wasn't carving new empires or crushing rebellions. In fact, his reign was fairly uneventful. Which is probably why his death is the only thing people remember. History is funny like that. You could spend decades trying to lead a nation, sign treaties, oversee infrastructure, hold court, and none of that will matter if you get outsmarted by a pastry. Now, here's what we know. It was Fat Tuesday, the final day before Lent, a time for indulgence, for celebration, for stuffing yourself full of everything you're supposed to give up for the next 40 days. Think Mardi Gras, but with less jazz and more herring. And Adolf Frederick, well, he took it seriously. He feasted. Not nibbled, not sampled. Feasted. Historical records say he ate a meal that included lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and washed it down with champagne. Already a rich man's dream buffet. But then came the grand finale. Dessert. And not just a dessert. 14 helpings of it. 14. Of a thing called semla. If you've never had a semla, imagine a fluffy, cardamom-spiced bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream, floating in a bowl of warm milk, sweet, rich, creamy, innocent, until you eat over a dozen of them. Grr, that's what he did. He ate 14 semlor in a single sitting. And then he died. All doctors at the time listed the cause as digestive problems. So, which is the 18th century equivalent of a doctor shrugging and going, well, yeah? Modern interpretations suggest he probably suffered a heart attack or a stroke, some catastrophic shutdown triggered by the overload of rich food. But the phrase digestive problems stuck. And so did the legacy. Adolf Frederick became the king who ate himself to death. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds like a joke. But that's exactly why it stuck. Because history rarely honors moderation. It remembers the extreme. And this was extreme. No, but here's the thing that gets me. He wasn't at war. He wasn't under threat. He wasn't betrayed. He was at home, comfortable, celebrating. And that's when death tapped him on the shoulder. That's why it hits differently. Because it wasn't a tragedy of ambition. It was a tragedy of indulgence. Of giving in, one bite too many. When I first read about Adolf Frederick, I laughed. But then I sat with it. And I realized there's something eerily modern about his ending. A king brought down not by war, but by excess. A man who had everything, every luxury, every pleasure. And he chose more. And then more again. Until even his body said, no more. There's something symbolic about that. He didn't fall on a battlefield. He didn't die at the hands of a rival. He died because his appetite couldn't say no. And that's kind of all of us, isn't it? In one way or another. Always reaching for just one more bite, one more scroll, one more hit of dopamine, until something breaks. Sweden didn't fall apart after his death. The monarchy moved on. His son took the throne. But his legacy? That's forever. To this day, when Swedes celebrate Fat Tuesday with semlor, someone always brings him up. The king who loved them a little too much. The man who became a cautionary tale disguised as a punchline. The monarch remembered not for power or policy, but for pastry. And maybe that's the lesson. That no matter how high you climb, your downfall can come in the softest, fluffiest form imaginable. That kings don't always die with swords in their backs. Sometimes they die with cream in their stomachs. And that's still a death worth telling. We've walked through kings, through laughter, through too many desserts, through emperors turned into furniture. But now we step into the dirt, into the streets, into the wild eyes and barefoot genius of a man who spat in the face of power, who rejected society so hard it folded in on itself, trying to make sense of him. A man who didn't just speak his philosophy, he was his philosophy. Indeed, this is the story of Diogenes of Sinope, the cynic, the rebel, the dog, and the man who may have died by holding his own breath just to prove a point. Let me tell you how I first met Diogenes. Not in person, obviously, I don't time travel. But in college, I picked up this old philosophy reader. Thick, smelled like mildew. The cover was cracked, like it had been stepped on by someone in sandals. And there, between Plato and Aristotle, was a name I'd never heard. Diogenes. His bio read like a fever dream. Lived in a barrel, defied authority, mocked Alexander the Great, masturbated in public, called himself a dog. I sat there blinking, unsure if it was a joke. But it wasn't. To D, Diogenes was very, very real. And he was the kind of man who'd make today's social media look tame. He was born around 412 BCE in Sinope, a Greek colony on the Black Sea. His father was a banker, which is hilarious, considering Diogenes would go on to reject all material wealth. He wasn't always a street philosopher. At first, he just got in trouble for defacing currency, literally defacing actual coins. Some historians think it was a metaphor for questioning social values. Others say he was just a troll. Either way, he was exiled. And he took exile as freedom. He moved to Athens, already the intellectual heart of the ancient world. But instead of joining the elite circles of Socrates' descendants or attending lectures at the academy, Diogenes lived on the streets. Yeah, and not just lived, thrived. He slept in a large ceramic jar near the agora, ate scraps, wore rags, bathed in rivers. And yet, people gathered to listen. Because Diogenes didn't teach like a normal philosopher, he insulted people, threw shade before shade was invented. He once walked around with a lantern in broad daylight, claiming he was looking for an honest man. Spoiler, he never found one. He believed in freedom from want. He thought possessions were chains. That shame was a social illusion. That happiness came from rejecting artificial needs. He was like a punk rocker dropped into a toga party. And the thing is, he was brilliant. He saw through things. Once, when Plato defined man as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken, brought it into the academy, and shouted, "Behold, Plato's man!" They had to revise the definition. He insulted kings, mocked the rich, laughed at politicians. Worry? And then came the moment that made him immortal. Neonotians, Alexander the Great. Yes, that Alexander once visited Athens and asked to meet Diogenes. They found him sunbathing. The conqueror of the world stood before him and said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Tsuchki. Diogenes looked up, squinted, and replied, "Yes, move, you are blocking the sun." That was it. No bowing, no fear. Just sunlight. Alexander reportedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." And I believe him. Because power bows to clarity, and Diogenes had more clarity than any man alive. So how did he die? Here's where things get strange. Because for a man who lived without possessions, who challenged death and shame and fear and pride, you'd expect him to go out in some dramatic fashion. But instead, history gives us a few different theories. One says he ate raw octopus, got sick, and died. Another says he was bitten by a dog, which is almost poetic, given he called himself one. But the one that sticks? The one I keep circling back to? He held his breath. Voluntarily. As in, I'm done. Goodbye. And just stop breathing. Can you imagine that? Choosing to end yourself not with poison or blade or rope, but just by denying the most basic function of life. Just not inhaling. It sounds impossible, but with Diogenes, I believe it. Because his whole life was one long middle finger to control, to dependency, to the tyranny of needs. And breath? Breath is the need we can't escape. Maybe he saw that as the last chain to break. And so he broke it. On his own terms. No audience, no speech, no fanfare. Just silence. Diogenes didn't leave behind a school. No library. No grand text. Just echoes. Stories, jokes, parables. And a way of living so raw and unfiltered it still feels modern. He died as he lived, unimpressed, with a world that always asked for more, and a heart that always said less. Sometimes I wish I could talk to him. Ask what he'd think of our lives today. Would he laugh? Would he pity us? Would he pluck a chicken and hold it up to our screens? Maybe he'd just wave a hand and walk away. Back into the jar. Back into the sun. This is the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Roman history, a man who tried to conquer the world with silver in his veins, and was punished for his greed in the most symbolically brutal way imaginable. They say he died choking on molten gold. And whether that's literal or not doesn't matter, because in the end his wealth became his coffin. Or Crassus wasn't born poor, but he wasn't born a legend either. In fact, he kind of got there sideways. While Julius Caesar was charming the people and Pompey was winning battles, Crassus was doing something a little less romantic. He was buying things. A lot of things. Especially things that were on fire. Here's how it worked. Crassus built a private fire brigade in Rome. Dozens of men trained to put out fires. Sounds noble, right? Now here's the twist. When a building caught fire, Crassus and his team would show up, but they wouldn't do anything. Not yet. What? They'd find the panicked owner, and Crassus would make an offer. Sell it to me now, for next to nothing, or I walk away. And if the owner refused, Crassus would give the signal. And the fire would rage on. If the deal was made, the brigade would leap into action. They'd save what they could. And Crassus would own yet another property. Now imagine doing this, hundreds of times. He bought homes, businesses, entire neighborhoods. And with each fire, he became richer. He owned silver mines, slave labor, real estate in every direction. By the time he was at his peak, Crassus wasn't just wealthy, he was mythic. And he wasn't satisfied, because wealth can only take you so far in Rome. What mattered was glory. Military victory, legacy, statues. So Crassus looked east, and set his sights on Parthia. Now, if you've never heard of the Parthian Empire, think of it like Rome's shadow, a rival in the east, skilled horsemen, deadly archers, and absolutely not interested in being conquered. But Crassus didn't care. In 53 BCE, he marched out with 7 legions and a head full of ambition. He thought he'd sweep through, claim some quick victories, and ride home dripping in gold and fame. Instead, he walked into a desert ambush. The Parthians lured him in with false peace envoys, fake negotiations, then crushed his forces in the sands of Carrhae. Imagine Roman soldiers used to city fighting and tight formations, suddenly being peppered by horseback archers who moved like shadows. Thousands were killed. Crassus's son was among them, his head cut off and paraded on a pike. The rest of the army? Shattered. And Crassus? He tried to negotiate his way out. But the Parthians weren't interested in diplomacy. They wanted a show. What happened next is one of the most infamous deaths as a message in recorded history. They grabbed Crassus, bound him. And depending on which account you believe, they forced his mouth open and poured molten gold down his throat, burning him from the inside out. They wanted him to choke on the very thing he had worshipped. Gold, the symbol of his rise, and now the tool of his destruction. Not a sword, not poison, but liquid money turned into fire. It was symbolic execution as high art, a grim punchline, a political cartoon made out of flesh and screaming. You wanted gold? Here, drink it. Now, some historians argue that the story's exaggerated, that maybe the Parthians just killed him normally, and the gold detail was Roman propaganda, a way to explain his failure by turning it into a morality tale. But does that even matter? Because the story stuck. Rome believed it. Rome needed to believe it. Because it made sense. Of course, that's how Crassus died. The man who bought burning buildings. The man who profited from other people's misfortune. The man who was already so bloated with wealth that the only thing left was to drown in it. And that's why we still remember him. Not for what he conquered, not for how he governed, but for how he died. Because that death said something. It was a warning to every rich man who thought gold could buy anything. And maybe a warning to the rest of us, too. That some things, ambition, greed, ego, they're fire in disguise. And if you swallow too much of it, it swallows you back. Crassus wanted to be remembered like Caesar, like Pompey, like Alexander. And in a way, he got his wish. But not for a triumph. Not for a city. Not for a law or a war or a speech. He's remembered for the sound his throat must have made when molten gold filled it. A gurgle, a hiss, the soft sigh of wealth turning to ash. Now it's time. Because after all the kings, mystics, and madmen, we come to a man who wasn't born a legend. He didn't start with riches or robes or palaces. He started in chains. He wasn't a philosopher or an emperor or a general. He was a slave. But by the time his story ended, the Roman world trembled at the sound of his name. Spartacus. He didn't die quietly. He didn't die for greed. He didn't even die trying to escape. Atu. He died fighting, in a storm of dust and blood, facing impossible odds with nothing left to lose. This is the death of Spartacus, and it's one of the loudest exits in history. You probably know the name, maybe from the movie, maybe from the meme. I am Spartacus. It's iconic, it's dramatic, but most people don't know the whole story. They don't know how it started, or how hard he fought, or how close he came to breaking one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. And they definitely don't know how it ended. Let me show you. Spartacus was born in Thrace, somewhere near modern-day Bulgaria. Back then, Thracians were considered fierce and wild by the Romans. Good warriors, bad subjects. He may have served in the Roman military at some point, maybe even as an auxiliary. But something went wrong. Well, maybe he deserted. Maybe he was captured. Maybe he fought back one too many times. Whatever the reason, he ended up in chains. And not just any chains, gladiator chains. Sent to a training school in Capua. Imagine it. Dust, sweat, screams, and the constant taste of iron in your mouth. This wasn't like the movies. Gladiators weren't glamorous. They were tools. Entertainment. They fought for blood and bread in the sand, and they died when the crowd got bored. But Spartacus? He didn't die. He watched. He waited. And in 73 BCE, he rebelled. Not with swords or spears. With kitchen knives. He and about 70 other slaves broke out of the gladiator school with whatever they could grab. They fought their way out, stole weapons from a wagon, and vanished into the hills of Mount Vesuvius. The Roman authorities barely blinked. A few runaway slaves. They'd be crushed in a week. Except they weren't. They started winning. More slaves joined them, dozens, hundreds, then thousands. People who had nothing left to lose. They weren't just escaping, they were fighting back. And Spartacus, he led them. Not with speeches or titles, but with action, with courage, with strategy that stunned even Roman commanders. He divided his forces, trapped legions, used terrain like a blade. He turned a band of runaways into a rebel army. At their peak, some say they were over 100,000 strong. They defeated trained Roman legions multiple times. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning. The Senate started to panic. This wasn't a revolt. This was a war. And it was being led by a man who wasn't supposed to be remembered at all. A footnote turned to firestorm. Now here's where the tragedy begins. Spartacus didn't want to conquer Rome. At least, not at first. He wanted freedom. There's evidence that he tried to march his army north, out of Italy, to escape, to scatter, to let the rebels live free. But his followers, they wanted more. They wanted revenge, wealth, glory. So they stayed. And Spartacus, despite his better judgment, stayed with them. Maybe because he felt responsible. Maybe because he knew escape wasn't freedom unless everyone got it. So they turned back south. And Rome? Rome sent Marcus Licinius Crassus, yes, molten gold Crassus, to finish the job. And he didn't hold back. He built walls, literal walls across southern Italy. He dug trenches, cut off food, waited. And finally, when Spartacus tried to break through, the final battle came. It happened in 71 BCE near the river Salaris. Spartacus knew it was the end. He wasn't surrounded by elite warriors. His forces were weakened, starving, disorganized. But he didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't surrender. He charged. According to ancient accounts, he fought his way directly toward Crassus himself. cutting through enemy lines like a man possessed. He wanted to end it at the source, to cut off the head of the beast. He was wounded. He was bleeding. But he kept going, until the crush of bodies swallowed him. His body was never found, not because he escaped, but because in the chaos, in the storm of blood and steel, Spartacus vanished into the myth he'd become. The Romans crucified over 6,000 of his followers along the Appian Way. Miles of bodies. A warning to the world. But the man himself, gone. No cage, no parade. No broken rebel paraded through Rome. Just emptiness. And a name that echoed louder than any victory. Here's what I think about when I think of Spartacus. He didn't die a king. He didn't die a saint. He died as a spark. And sparks don't get gravestones. They get legends. He was never meant to survive. But he also wasn't meant to lead a war, or nearly tear Rome apart. But he did. He turned spoons into swords, shame into fury, chains into banners, and even in death, he wasn't captured. He wasn't bent. He wasn't broken. He just ended exactly how he lived, fighting.